Okay. Okay. All right. I want to welcome everyone to another webinar hosted by Museum Study. Today's webinar, New Policies for New Problems and Other Topics in the new revised third edition of Things Great and Small, Collections Management Policies, is presented by John Simmons. The third edition of Things Great and Small was released last month and is available through Rowman and Littlefield now. I'll post a link to it a little later in the chat. I am Brad Breedyhoff with Museum Study. Museum Study provides online professional development for people who work in or with cultural institutions. I see a few participants who have participated in our courses in the past. John is a museum consultant, author, educator, curator, and instructor for 2 of our courses. He has authored more than 150 popular and technical articles and books on museum studies and natural history topics, including Museum Registration Methods, Volume 6 with Tony Kaiser. John leads our 4-week online course, Policies for Managing Collections, that will run in July using the new edition of the book. But if you have the second edition, that will be acceptable as well. John also leads our Laws and Collection Management course that will run in August. We are excited to have such a large group of you from all manner of cultural institutions and collections. I think I just said about 120 participants from at least 15 countries signed up for this today. And great to see such a variety of collections represented. And of course, that was part of what John tried to address in the third edition, but I'll let him say more about that. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel. I'll send a link to the recording to everyone who registered for it after we're done. During the presentation, if you are not yet muted, please mute yourself. You can ask questions during the presentation, which we'll then pose to John when we get to the Q&A. And you're also welcome to unmute yourself during the Q&A if you want to ask those questions yourself. We do have other webinars coming up later this year. There'll be one that'll be co-led by 2 of our instructors. One teaches our K-12 lesson plan course, and the other teaches our virtual learning course. And they're going to co-do a webinar later this year. And then I'm trying to get Nancy Odegaard to do a course because she is releasing the second version of her Old Poisons text. And so hopefully sometime this summer, she's going to do a webinar about the second edition of that text. So with that, I will turn it over to you, John.
All right, let me share the screen here. I presume that you can see that all right?
Yes.
Okay, so in this webinar, we're going to consider how collection management policies can be used to prevent future problems, including some problems that most museums have not confronted before. So we'll begin here with a quiz. I'm going to describe 5 museum problems that were recently in the news. And as I go through these, think about how these problems could have been prevented. So the first is that an independent review of the British Museum in London revealed that insider thefts from the collection had resulted in the loss of more than 1,500 objects. The second is the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C., which had to repatriate to Iraq and Egypt more than 15,000 objects that had been purchased from antiquities dealers. They had to pay a large fine for illegally importing them. And then they discovered that all 16 of the museum's Dead Sea Scroll fragments they had purchased were forgeries. The third issue is that 3 paintings were removed from the Brauer Museum of Art at Valparaiso University in Indiana by the university administration to be sold for $20 million to fund renovation of student dormitories. Our fourth example is that in late December and early January, hundreds of museums were hit by ransomware cyber attacks. The attacks came through gallery system software that used cloud storage. And the museums that were hit included the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston and Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art in Bentonville. And then there was a recent report from the insurance industry that announced that museum insurance rates were increasing nationwide because of the increasing number of incidents of damage resulted from people backing into exhibits while they were taking selfies. So the question is, how could these have been prevented? And the answer, of course, is all of these could have been prevented by having good collection management policies in your museum. For instance, the British Museum should have had a policy that required documented tracking of all objects within the museum at all times as they move from place to place. The Museum of the Bible should have had a policy that required thorough provenance work for all proposed accessions. The Brauer Museum of Art should have had a clear authority statement in their collection management policy that established whether the museum or the university owned the objects in the collection, because it turned out the university owned them, not the museum. And they should have had a policy mandating strict adherence to professional standards and ethics, which would have prevented the sale of those objects to renovate dormitories. The cyber attacks did not affect all gallery system users. It only affected the museums that were using cloud storage. Those that used their own servers were fine and did not have their data taken hostage. But museums should have policies that prevent putting using collection management systems that put important information into cloud storage, because that makes it more vulnerable to hacking. And the damage taking selfies that's causing insurance rates to increase could have been prevented if museums had policies that prohibited taking selfies except at selfie stations, which they could establish in areas where people were less likely to back into exhibits. But to get a better idea of how collection management policies work, what we're going to do is a quick review of the history of the collection care profession in museums. Because oddly enough, collection management policies are relatively new in the history of museums. So our modern museums evolved from the cabinets of curiosities of the Renaissance, and in many ways, the cabinets were very similar to modern museums. They had objects arranged on exhibit, they had tours for visitors, and they had collection catalogs. The first comprehensive work to address the acquisition and organization of collections was published in 1565 by Samuel von Kiechberg, and it gave advice on how to collect and arrange objects in collections, but it said nothing about collection care. 150 years later, in 1727, the next significant work on museums was published by an object dealer in Hamburg. The title to this book translates as Museographia, or Guide to the Correct Concept and Useful Application of the Museum Chamber of Rarities. And this book actually did offer some advice on caring for collections. Among other things, it said that objects should be brought out and put on a table in the center of the room to be examined, to minimize handling and accidents. And it said that objects should be stored in dry conditions, kept out of direct sunlight, that museums should have both an accession book and a catalog. And this was also the first book to address the differences in exhibiting objects in a small square room compared to a large rectangular gallery, and that had to do with the lighting that was coming in. But the book still said nothing about collection management policies. In fact, the collection management policies were developed only after the collection care became a distinct profession within museums. The first professional museum organization wasn't founded until 1889, and that was in the United Kingdom, and it's still around as the Collections Association. And it was not until around 1900 that museums began hiring people with titles such as registrar. The American Association of Museums, now the American Alliance of Museums, was founded in 1906. Formal training did not get started for museums until the 1920s, and until that time, collection care was little more than record keeping and dusting things off. But the real growth of academic museum studies programs really didn't get started until the 1970s. And at that time, the title of collection manager also came into common use. The American Alliance of Museums Registrars Committee wasn't even started until 1977, which is fairly late in the game. So the professionalization of collection care really began with Dorothy Dudley and Irma Wilkinson, who were really you should consider the founding mothers of museum registration and collection management. Dorothy Dudley graduated from Wheaton College. She did an apprenticeship at the Newark Museum in 1925 and became registrar there in 1932. In 1936, she moved to the Museum of Modern Art in New York City, where she spent the remainder of her career. And in New York, she met Irma Bezold Wilkinson, who had graduated from the University of Wisconsin in 1929 and then gone to work for the Metropolitan Museum of Art the next year in 1930. Wilkinson served as the museum's registrar from 1949 until she retired in 1963, and she was also an international authority on Middle Eastern and Islamic art. So in the mid-1950s, Dorothy Dudley and Irma Wilkinson began working on the first truly comprehensive book on the registration of museum collections. So they began by sending a questionnaire to about 200 museums around the country for input on how they took care of their collections and handled registrations. They reviewed the very scant literature on the subject, and what's important to note is that this time both Dudley and Wilkinson were very experienced registrars at the time that this project was started. Irma Wilkinson was 52, Dorothy Dudley was 55. This is undoubtedly a big part of why the book was immediately successful. It was based on their combined decades of experience, as well as their extensive consultation with other people in the profession. And in the book, they explain that cooperative labor and support produced this manual and really set the tone for museum registration and collection management. So Museum Registration Methods was published in 1958. It was fairly modest, 225 pages. It had 16 contributing authors, but it had a really profound effect on how museum collections were managed. The second edition came out 10 years later in 1968, and by the third edition in 1979, it had grown to 473 pages, but it still barely mentioned policies. It was not until the fourth edition, which came out in 1958, that the phrase collection management policies was used, but the section on collection management policies in that edition was only 3 pages long. But that edition had 2 new editors, Rebecca Buck and Jean Gilmore, who significantly reorganized and expanded the book, and they changed the title to The New Museum Registration Methods. By the 5th edition, which came out in 2010, it had grown to 516 pages with 68 authors. And the most recent version is the 6th edition, which was published in 2020, and it was edited by Tony Kaiser and me. And we were still using the same arrangement that Rebecca Buck and Jean Gilmore developed. So as the role of registrars and collection managers evolved, it was decided that a book on collection management policies was needed. So in 2006, I was asked to write Things Great and Small. And I got a lot of help and advice from the members of the American Alliance of Museums Registrars Committee, including from Rebecca Buck and Jean Gilmore. And a second edition was published in 2018. And if you think editors are tough, you haven't dealt with a registrar reviewing your work yet. It was very good help, but it was not an easy job getting the manuscript into a condition they found acceptable. Last year, my editor asked me if I was interested in doing a third edition. So for an author, a revised edition is very tempting because this gives you an opportunity to correct all the mistakes you made in the previous edition, but it also means you're going to have the opportunity to make a lot of new mistakes in the new edition. But the big question really was another edition needed? And if so, what issues should be included? Well, for starters, there is a lot of new information available since the last edition was published in 2018. So there's new research about the interactions of objects and their storage environments. There is a renewed emphasis in museums on decolonization and repatriation. And following the COVID epidemic, that we were all reminded how ephemeral we are and how sensitive our collections are to neglect. There is also the trend in museums for fewer collections care personnel to have the responsibility for managing ever larger collections, rarely with a budget increase. There is still a lack of good collection management databases. There is information needed on how to manage the increasing accumulation of born digital collection documentation and born digital objects. And of course, The acceleration of climate change means that museums are now having to cope with changing weather patterns and concerns about future sustainability. So we decided that yes, a new edition was in order. So the new revised edition was published in April, and we don't have time to discuss all of the changes in the third edition today. And instead, I want to talk about 8 of the most specific new concerns that collection management policies should address. And so these are collection impact statements to help make accessioning decisions and plan for the future. The problems of preserving electronic information, particularly born digital objects. Policies to assure the security of collections during temporary and permanent closure of museums. How in the future fewer people can manage larger collections. In other words, how we can do more with less. The lack of good usable collection management databases. Decolonization of collections, which normally is an issue that affects curators and administrators, but the point of view of collection management is important in this as well. And then I want to address 2 closely related issues, climate change and sustainability. So we'll begin with collection management impact statements. This is an image of a pretty common museum dilemma. It's something we can all relate to. I took this photo of my colleague Jeanette Munoz, and she and I were at this time advising the National Museum of Colombia in Bogota on a common problem. They have growing collections, but very little space and very limited resources for handling the incoming objects. So Jeanette and I suggested 2 policies that really all museums should have. First is a much stronger accession policy that describes not only what the museum does accept, but also what it doesn't, which makes it easier to turn down things that you don't need. But also a policy that requires a collection impact statement for each proposed accession. The collection impact statement should include a description of the object, its dimensions, what it's made out of, the amount of space it would occupy in storage if it is accepted, whether there are any provenance or legal issues with its acquisition, whether the object might pose a risk to other objects in the collection or to the museum staff or visitors. And it should include details of any special handling, housing needs, or things like that, such as custom-made supports or containers, or the need for a special microenvironment. And based on this information, a good collection manager should be able to give a reasonable estimate of the cost of accepting and housing and caring for this object for the next 20 years, which is very useful for deciding whether or not to accept objects or not in your collection. Every museum should have a digital information preservation policy. I started my career back when it was exceedingly rare for museums to even have a computer, but today museums generate vast amounts of digital information about their collections, and some now record all information about the objects they acquire only in electronic form. Even the museum catalog is often now in only electronic form. Well, digital information is nice, it's easy to create, and it's very easy to use. The downside is there are no means of saving electronic information for the long-term future. And by long-term, I don't mean 20 or 30 years, I mean hundreds of years. All current means of digital storage use magnetic particles that are embedded in polymers, neither of which are stable materials in the long term. Electronic information can be recopied and reformatted as hardware and software change, but reformatting is expensive, it's time-consuming, and it ultimately results in data loss. And this is complicated by the fact that all digital hardware and software have very short lives. And if that wasn't enough, we also have to think about the carbon cost of creating and storing digital data, which is very high. The storing 100 gigabytes of information in the cloud has a carbon footprint of 0.2 tons of CO2 per year. By contrast, paper has essentially a fixed one-time carbon cost, the cost of its manufacture. Some of the documents we generate can be digital because they do not become part of the museum's permanent archives, but other documents, particularly acquisition, accession, and catalog records, should be both digital because digital records are much easier to search, and they should be on paper because paper is permanent. A digital information policy should provide guidelines for deciding which documents should be only digital, which documents should be paper-based, and which documents should be both digital and paper-based. The lack of means to save digital information long-term is a problem that the community cannot keep on ignoring. So think about it this way. We can still read collection catalogs from the cabinets of curiosities that are more than 500 years old, but we cannot read most of the digital files that we created less than 30 years ago. It's a very serious problem. Another of the new sections concerns policies for temporary and permanent closing. I never imagined that most museums would have to worry about this, but of course, COVID changed all that very suddenly in 2020 when museums found themselves forced to shut down with very little guidance about how to go about it. So the policy for closing should mandate that collection storage be maintained in good order at all times, that objects must be returned to the collection storage array promptly after they have been used, and that the location of all objects in the museum be tracked. And the policy should specify that ongoing activities, plans, and projects be transparent, so another person could easily figure out how to take over them if it was necessary. The policy should also mandate that key staff members should keep a list of tasks that can be done off-site in the event of a temporary closure. And this would include things like proofreading the database, which is something we all tend to put off, writing object labels, doing in-depth provenance research on things in the collection, and writing out our standard operating procedures, all of which are things that we need to do, all of which are things that we tend to not do because we don't have time. And the policy should require that you keep a regularly updated list of critical staff members and their emergency contact information. And updated is the key. And the policy should require that you make arrangements now with the museum officials and law enforcement authorities to allow you to go back inside a closed museum to check on the collections should that museum have to close in an emergency. It is very difficult to make these arrangements during an emergency in an emergency situation. So those arrangements need to be worked out beforehand. Which brings me to number 4, which is too much work to do and not enough time to do it. So how can policies address this issue? Well, I got my first job in a museum as a freshman in college, and that means that I have now worked in museums for 55 years. And during that time, one of the most disturbing trends I have witnessed is that there are fewer and fewer collections personnel now caring for increasingly larger collections. Anyone who works in a museum knows there is more work than they can possibly fit into a regular workday or a work week or even a work year, and the situation is getting worse as museums struggle financially. So what policies can do is provide guidelines for triage of what needs to be done and for documentation strategies to help you manage that workload. For instance, guidance on how to prioritize collection care tasks to make sure that the most important jobs get done first, and guidance for how to spread tasks out over longer periods of time by scheduling these things on a calendar. So there's all sorts of ways that you can plan ahead and reduce your overwhelming workload. Item number 5 is the lack of good collection management collection management databases. We need good collection management databases. Despite the astounding number of databases currently available for museums, none are good collection management tools because they are all designed to dispense collection information, not to manage collections. What we need are collection management databases that include management tools that will allow us to incorporate such things into our collection database as environmental monitoring data, so we know what our objects have been exposed to, integrated pest management records, the records of use of objects, and budgetary information. And only when we combine this with the information on the objects of our collection will we have databases that are truly useful for managing collections. Another issue of great concern for museums is decolonization. And although decolonization decisions are usually made by administrators and curators, there should be a collection management role in the decolonization policy. For one thing, too often we think of decolonization as removing objects from the collection, but this is an oversimplification. Decolonization should be a process of sharing the authority for the interpretation of the objects in the collection. Decolonization should not be about erasing the past, but rather about gaining a better understanding of our objects, about the humanity's shared history, about the stories we tell, and the perspectives that we use to tell those stories. So collection management policies can address such things as the use of indigenous languages for object names and for place names in the database and on exhibit labels. We can ensure that we do better provenance research on where the objects came from by using a wider range of sources so that we know more about our objects than we did in the past. The issue is important enough that the Metropolitan Museum of Art recently created a brand new staff position, Head of Provenance Research, after several objects from their collections were seized. So for collection management, decolonization can also mean incorporating cultural traditions into exhibitions and into collections care, and doing a better job of acquisition so that decolonization will not be needed in the future. Number 7 is climate change. And this is arguably the most serious issue facing museums today, at least I believe it is. And the issue is how we're going to adapt to these changing climates. Climate change is wreaking havoc with weather patterns, and this is going to continue as the Earth warms, making it far more complicated to control the collection storage environment. A good definition of climate change is the long-term transition in average weather patterns across the world. So depending on where you live, you can expect increased periods of rain or drought or both, hotter summers and colder winter weather, worse storms, higher winds, erratic weather patterns, and all of the damage that will come to the infrastructure because of these changes. If you happen to live in a coastal area, the changes are going to be even more extreme. So what can we do through collection management policies to cope with changes like this? One is we can schedule a regular reevaluation of the risks to our collections because these change. So what are the risks and what are the likelihood of those risks occurring in the foreseeable future? We can also retrofit buildings to provide a better buffer against the external environment and to reduce our reliance on mechanical heating and cooling systems. Retrofits might include such things as installing thermal windows, using window awnings or over roofs to reflect the heat off of our building, adding insulation, enlarging gutters and drains to better cope with sudden rainstorms, and adding ceiling fans in collection storage areas. And we should move collection storage out of the attic or out of the basement and into the center of the building where the environment is much more stable. Closely related to climate change is the issue of sustainability. And sustainability can be defined easily as meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. And in short, this means reducing energy use and adopting practices that have a minimal effect on the environment. So there's some pretty interesting work going on about how museums can be more sustainable while still providing a stable storage environment for collections. For example, we can design new buildings that are more energy efficient by working with architects who understand passive design. Or we can retrofit our existing buildings. If you have an old building, and by old, I mean a building older than me, one that was built before central air conditioning was standard, there may be architectural features that you can use to improve the circulation of air and maintain a good storage environment while greatly reducing your heating or cooling costs. For example, using windows, cupolas, and roof vents to move air through the building, and using ceiling fans to even out the stratification of relative humidity in collection storage. It's often possible to use scheduled shutdowns of your central heating and cooling systems rather than running them continuously, because that saves energy and it saves wear and tear on the equipment. This is an image of the museum where I used to work at the University of Kansas. The beautiful left-hand part of the building was built in 1905, long before air conditioning. The tower, which is now glassed in, was designed to be left open so that air moved through the building and kept it cool and well ventilated. The very ugly right-hand wing was added in 1964, and it, of course, has to be air conditioned. So we need to reconsider those old building designs. Often they were more attractive, and they also were often more functional, and some of that functionality can be recaptured in many cases to make a more sustainable building. We can stop using a single year-round set point for temperature and relative humidity in collection storage and instead use different seasonal ranges for summer and winter. Back in the 1980s, it was widely believed that museums should maintain 50 to 55% relative humidity with plus or minus 5% and a temperature of 65 to 70 with fluctuations of no more than 1.5 degrees year-round. But we have learned a lot since then about how objects react with the storage environment. So current recommendations for most collection objects are much broader, 40 to 55% relative humidity, with temperatures of 59 to 77 degrees that fluctuate no more than 7 degrees in 24 hours. And for some types of objects, even wider ranges are acceptable. We can do things like replace tungsten and fluorescent lights with LEDs. Tungsten and fluorescent lighting produces heat, ultraviolet radiation, and it uses far more energy than LED light sources. We can reduce waste and recycle many of the materials we use in daily museum operation, and we can use silica gel in seal containers to create passive microenvironments for collection-sensitive objects. Use the sustainable hierarchy. You begin by reducing energy use wherever you can, and you then try to find ways to use your energy more efficiently. And as it becomes possible, you change to renewable energy sources that ultimately then you can take actions to offset residual emissions. So this is achieving sustainability is not something you do all at once. It's a process that you need to go through. The building in this image is the Paleontology Research Laboratory at the South Dakota School of Mines and Technology in Rapid City, South Dakota. It has a LEED Gold rating. LEED stands for Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design, which rates buildings based on criteria such as energy efficiency, water conservation, and indoor environmental quality. So yes, it is entirely possible to build efficient, sustainable, LEED certified buildings, even in a climate as crazy as the one in Rapid City, South Dakota. So I want to wrap up today with another question. Given how important good collection management policies are, why doesn't everybody have them? And so these are some of the most common excuses I hear. We are too busy, so busy that we don't have time to write policies. Well, this is a lousy excuse because good policies will save you time and money in the long run, and they're not all that hard to prepare. Another excuse is we don't have enough staff to write policies. And again, that's not a good excuse. You can get colleagues from other museums or some of your board members to help you out. Or another one, we don't need policies because everyone knows how to do things the right way. And I've actually heard that a number of times. And my answer to that is, really? You can't enforce unwritten policies. And because unwritten policies are not endorsed by the museum's governing authority, they're pretty useless for anything except starting arguments. So another excuse I hear is we don't know how to prepare collection management policies, which is a pretty good excuse, except there is a lot of good advice on how to write collection management policies in the museum literature. There's a lot available online and from your professional museum organizations, be they local, state, regional, or national. And I might also mention there is a nice new book about how to prepare collection management policies that you could read. And Museum Study offers a course called Policies for Managing Collections that will help you write policies or update the ones that you already have. For those of you who do not have any collection management policies at all, I recommend starting with the new free online toolkit for streamlined collection management policies. And this comes from the Center for the Conservation of Art and Historic Artifacts in Philadelphia. This free online program will get you started in the right direction to make your first time policy development much easier. And it's a series of very simple steps that you go through, providing information about your institution. And from that, you can develop some very decent policies. So whether you have policies or not, I recommend getting the staff together, perhaps with some board members, and playing the monopolicy game. This is a game that is designed to be fun and foster communication among staff, because even though I have worked with museum collection management policies since 2006, I think they're really boring. And this is an attempt to make them a little more interesting because they're important and they shouldn't be boring. So this game will help people understand how policies and resources can be used together to prevent or resolve problems. And the game is a free download courtesy of Museum Study LLC. And if you just Google the word monopolicy, you'll find it, and it's available in both English and Spanish versions. And so basically players move around a board, they draw problem cards, and they draw policy cards and resource cards, and they use those resource and policy cards in combination to solve the problems. So in order to write a collection management policy, you do need to understand what collection management is. And I like to define it very broadly as everything that is done to care for and document the collections and make them available for use. So this means collection management encompasses acquisition, accession, registration, cataloging, care, use of the collections, which is primarily exhibition, education, or research, and also deaccessioning, the disposal of objects, collection security, conservation, storage, and access to collections. The interesting thing about collections in museums is collection management has a direct impact on every other activity in the museum, from administration to education, because ultimately all museum activities involve the collection at some level. You can divide collection management tasks into three broad categories: collection care, collection use, and preventive conservation. Care of the collection includes such things as registration and documentation, keeping the collection storage array in order, conducting regular inventories, things like that. Use of the collection includes access to the objects and the information about them, making the objects available for exhibition, research, or education, making loans, and the security of the collection. Preventive conservation is everything that is done to keep the objects in the best condition possible, which means things like mandating a stable storage environment, monitoring the environmental conditions, and monitoring individual objects in the collection, reducing risk to the collection, and using inert materials whenever you can. To be effective, collection management policies should be based on three categories of information: the mission, history, and traditions of the museum and the community it serves, because they're always going to be a little different from one institution to another. Is your museum focused local, regional, international? Are you the only museum in a community? Are you one of many? Is your museum purpose primarily exhibition or education or research, or do you do all three? Second is the legal and ethical constraints on how the museum acquires and uses objects and the museum's legal organization. Are you a freestanding, independent nonprofit? Are you part of a government institution? All of these are important. And the last category is the standards and best practices recognized by the profession. These are often treated as synonyms, but in fact, they're different. Standards are generally accepted and recognized levels of attainment that all museums should expect to achieve, and these are based on a consensus of the profession and approved by a professional organization, such as the International Council of Museums, or ICOM, or the American Alliance of Museums, the AAM. Best practices are generally agreed upon actions based on experience, And these change over time as we gain more experience. And they do not have a formal stamp of approval, but they are widely recognized among your colleagues in the profession. So these are both important. It's also important that collection management policies be written to meet the needs of each individual institution, its collections, and how the collections are used. So a policy should only be created to accomplish a specific goal. You shouldn't write a policy about something just because other museums have it. It's a question of, do you need it? Policy should address particular issues or solve particular problems. So, for example, in the Earth and Mineral Sciences Museum and Art Gallery at Penn State, they have a policy that requires the use of security hardware on art for exhibits. And in this picture, Dr. Julianne Snyder is preparing to install security hardware on the back of a painting. And you'll notice that I am not showing you the security hardware on the back of the painting because that would be a violation of the policy, but it is important to do. Individual policies will vary from one museum to another because no two museums are exactly alike. Each museum should develop its own policies that are appropriate for its particular collection and circumstances. This is why you should never just copy policies from another institution. It's fine to use them as a model, but don't ever just copy them and expect them to be useful to you. So to wrap all this up, this is a short version of what carefully considered and regularly revised collection management policies can do. They provide guidance for which objects are added to the collection, why and how those objects are added, how the objects are used once they're in the collection, how the collection is cared for. They should provide standards of professional conduct for museum employees, and they should provide good, clear policies, rather, should be supported by the museum's governing authority and the museum staff, and these can then prevent problems from occurring and help resolve problems promptly when they do arise. So I thank you very much. I believe we have time for questions, and if you don't ask your question at this point, you are welcome to email me. There is my email address, and I am pretty much always available. So I will, at this point, turn it back over to you, Brad.
Okay, we do have some questions, but a couple of things before that. One, I want to give some people a little background about what John's online course is like. It's a 4-week long course. It starts at the beginning of July and runs all month. It includes lessons that John has written, several readings, some of which are from the book. There are weekly discussions and weekly assignments. And part of the assignments is to start building your policy. So by the end of the course, you've built some of the components, or at least started some of the components of your policy. The goal by the end of the course is to have an outline for your policy, have started creating some of the pieces of the policy. We understand that 4 weeks is generally not enough time to actually complete a full policy because there are a lot of pieces to it, and there are other people involved in it that need to be consulted during the process. And in fact, John recommends that highly that you do involve other people in the process because it's going to be a lot better received and a lot better used if people have input on creating that policy. You also are subjected to 4 weekly sessions of John and I on Zoom, for better or worse. I also wanted to point out, John, that Jerry shared that he closes out his graduate collections management policy class by playing monopolicy.
Oh, very good.
Yeah, that was really fun to hear. There are questions, so I will read through some of them. And also, let's see, let me get back to the first one by Jason Akins. Jason, if you want to unmute yourself and say it yourself, you're welcome to do so. If not, I will read it.
Yeah, thank you. I think you mentioned saving paper records.
Yes.
Do you recommend printing your data entries and
I,
saving those?
I would either print the data entries, or I actually am old-fashioned enough. I think we should still keep a handwritten ledger of entries coming in. You don't have to include all of the object information that you might in an electronic database in a handwritten ledger, but the handwritten ledger has two advantages. One of which is it is going to be written in chronological order. It cannot be altered in that sense without it showing up. And the other is it's far more permanent than any printing method that you'll be able to use when printing information from a database. If you print from a database, you're probably going to be using a LaserJet printer, and the commercial laser printers we've gotten pretty good about the type adhering to the paper, but the desktop printers that we tend to use in museums do not generate enough heat and pressure to make a really good solid copy. The jury is still out on how long those copies will last, but I would not credit them with the 500 or 600 years we know we can get from a copy on acid-free paper written in high-quality ink. So I understand that you do not want to write by hand all of the information that you would go into a database, because this is one thing databases have done, is allowed us to greatly expand the information recorded. But I would record core information on paper, and if possible, on acid-free paper using a permanent ink. So that's my personal philosophy on it. Printing the database is probably the next best thing to do, but I think going to a system where all of your records are created electronically and then stored is very, very risky.
Colin Weaver has put out some really good information on the long-term viability of printing on paper, particularly inkjet and laser printing. Inkjet has gotten better. There are better inks that are more last longer and also better against running when exposed to water. Epson is particularly good at that, but that's a constantly
Yeah,
moving bar.
and inkjet printers are these days are more expensive and harder to find. But
So next question from Jenny White. Jenny, do you want to mute and ask it, or do you want me to? Jenny's question was, for sustainability, won't having windows open introduce dust, pollutants, and pests?
yes. So what you need to do is look at filters and screens, decide where those windows should be open, what parts of your building should be ventilated, and institute integrated pest management controls in those areas. The collection itself should not have wind blowing through it, of course, because of those issues. But it's a case of controlling where the airflow is, controlling where you are getting rid of heat, or where you're adding heat into the building. So yeah, yes, if you merely open windows, that would be a disaster. And but you can still make a sustainable building that takes advantage of existing wind currents and your existing climate, depending on where you are, and have a much more sustainable, maybe not completely, but much more sustainable collection storage by locating collection storage in the center of your building when things are exhibited, making sure those are in airtight cases. There are ways around all those problems, but yes, you will create those problems that must be part of your planning.
Yeah, as John mentioned, in older buildings, they were designed actually for the environment they lived in, to take advantage of the environment they lived in. So, for instance, in Hawaii, homes would be built so that they oriented towards the trade winds and allowed air to flow through the building using those trade winds. Similarly, older buildings often had transoms over the doors so that even when a door was closed, the transom could be open to allow airflow through the door. And that's more of an internal feature than an external feature of the structure. So using the way the building was constructed in older buildings to the way it was designed is important. And we've gotten away from that because we've retrofitted the buildings over time. Okay, Lori asked, is there plans to have the third edition of the book translated into Spanish?
Sadly enough, no. And the problem comes down to market size. And it would be relatively easy to get a Spanish translation of the book done. What would kill you is the distribution. And because you would have to have different distribution systems within each country, and you run into tariffs and all sorts of restrictions. And one way around that would be to have the book done electronically. But it is unclear whether there is an adequate market, and then again, how you would collect payment from different countries. I do think making collection information available in Spanish without charge is extremely successful. In 2005, my colleague Jeanette Munoz and I wrote a book on collection care of natural history collections in Spanish. And when the printed copies ran out, which was a couple of years after it was printed, we were able to make a PDF of that free, because it was sponsored by Conservation International. And it is still available. It's still being used. It's woefully out of date. We are working on a new edition now, but we're running into the same problem with the new edition. We would like to do an English version and a Spanish version, but unless it's electronic, we don't know how we're going to distribute it. And if you have paid much attention to electronic book prices, those are creeping up to be as high, or in some cases higher than printed books. So unless you can find a way to do it as a nonprofit, it's probably not going to be really profitable. Very few Spanish-speaking countries have enough museums to support something like the project of translating that book and reprinting it, although I would be all for it if you can find someone to take it
Well,
on.
it's something we might want to investigate with
Apoyo.
yes, thank you. That's what I was trying to think
Yeah,
of.
it
Apoyo.
always comes down to distribution but in this case, there's a copyright issue with the book and contract already. And if you did a translation, you'd have to get a new it gets very complex. I think everyone involved, including my editor at Rowman and Littlefield, thinks it's a really good idea. It's a case of there isn't a practical way to make it happen, at least not yet.
Okay. Next question comes from Tamara. Tamara, would you like to unmute and ask yourself?
Sure. So my question is, the biggest issue I've faced in dealing with collections is getting that buy-in from senior staff and board. I've worked at one museum where, they decided paper was evil and we need to get rid of everything. And I was like almost hugging my filing cabinet saying, no, we are keeping the object files. So, when you
Okay, I'm
have,
going to ask Tamara's question
yeah,
for her because
Oh no, she just asked.
yeah.
Yeah. So, well, I am all for it, and kudos to you for hugging that filing cabinet. What you often get with boards is board people tend to be brought in because they're from the business world, and you want the board to help translate your museum to the community and help you find resources. So they don't understand museums, and the paper being evil is a fairly common business perception, I think. So what I think this goes back to how your policies are put together. And in the book, I go into details about the various ways to prepare policies. And what I think is the best way is to create a policy writing team within the museum involving representations of the levels of staff. And it depends, of course, on how big your institution is, but also a board member or two. Bring them in and have them work on the policies as they are developed. And I also think it's a very good idea that each time you get a draft version of a policy, before it's ready, go ahead and send it out to everyone to look at. Every staff member from custodian to director and your board, and let them have input. And if they don't understand something, that's a good chance to educate them. Because if people have input into policies, they're far more inclined to follow them. And when you do present the completed policies to the board, you should do that in a context that allows you to explain what the policies are supposed to do and how they work. And another thing that you can do is bring your board into the museum, give them a behind the scenes tour, maybe not the entire board at once, maybe a few people at a time, so conversation is easier, but make sure your board understands what a collection is, how you got the objects and what you do with them, and why it is important they be governed by policies. I think it really comes down to education. None of us react well to being handed a set of rules and saying, these you have to follow. We react much better if we have all had a role in helping write those rules and establish why they're important. So that would be my answer. Okay, I'm not sure what has happened to Brad.
I think my connection is back.
Ah, there he is. All right, well, I just answered Tamara's question.
Maybe not.
So Well, you're getting subtle. We have one here from Gretchen Anderson. We have a storage room that is completely internal. Temperature, humidity control is amazing with no active environmental control. Yes, that is the beauty of these internal rooms. Museums have always stuck collections in the least usable places, which is an attic or a basement, or the next least usable, which is an outside wall, and then had to cover windows. Your people should have the windows. People should be in upper and lower floors and around the windows. Your collection should be internal, where it is nice and stable. All right. Are you back, Brad?
I think so. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Evidently, we're pushing the bandwidth here. So that's what I get for traveling. So, did you answer Corinne Marie's?
No, we have gotten down to the next question here is from A. Riley, and it's is it best to write a collections policy per collection / historic site, or would it be acceptable to include multiple sites in one document? That's going to depend on the nature of what you've got. If your sites are similar, your collections are similar, you're dealing with similar problems, sure, one policy might be easier, but you might find some details of things like collection storage or security issues that are going to be very site specific. So I would take a good look at how adaptable things are. You might wind up with a general collection management policy for all the sites with particular policies for particular problems at individual places, which would be easier than writing a complete collection management policy for every site. But I would really look at how common those are.
And once you've written one for one site, it's relatively easy to either add another site on or create one
Yeah.
for the other site.
Okay, Connie Marie, I believe, is the next one.
Corinne Marie, yes.
Yeah.
Corinne, you want to unmute yourself
Oh,
and ask
Corinne
your
Marie, I'm
question?
sorry.
Sure. Yeah. So my question, so I work for like a corporate nonprofit hybrid museum where we don't own the corporate part of the collection. We're just more of a repository, and we do document those. They do still get an accession number. However, there hasn't really been ever any pushback from the corporate side whenever we want to use any of the collection for exhibit or education, but we don't quite have a policy either, or anything that they sign, nothing that makes it official that we can or cannot use them. So I've been thinking, if they don't really push the issue, but it's technically a problem on the museum side of things, should we start
Well,
creating one, or is
it's not a problem until it becomes one, meaning it if things are if unless there is something corporate does that makes a change to the collections, you'd be fine. The issue would be, what if corporate decided to sell off parts of the collection or trade them away or start using them for private corporate benefits that put the collections at risk, such as using them in a banquet hall or something like that. So if your relationship with the parent corporation is good, you might just try sitting down and having a discussion about trying to clarify who has the ultimate responsibility for taking care of the collections. There's this thing that happens in museums a lot, which is a person is given responsibility for responsibility for a task without being given the authority for it. Meaning you as a collection manager would be given responsibility for taking care of the collection, but not the authority to tell people above you, like corporate. They can't do that, a certain thing with a collection object. And that's a problem. And so this is one thing collection management policies should do, is specify who has responsibility and who has authority. And this is one of those cases where you as the museum probably have the responsibility for caring for the objects, but you don't have the authority if the objects are owned by corporate. So you might see if you could work out some arrangement whereby you could also be given that authority or share that authority, which would give you a little more control over the collection. Because I can see the potential for problems arising easily in that situation.
thank you.
And I might also mention, at the behest of several colleagues who work in For-profit museums, I actually did address those in the new issue of the book, because in the previous issues, we only addressed nonprofits, but there are enough for-profit museums now around that we had to include some issues having to do with ownership of the collection and proceeds from sales and things. So that the new book does address for-profit museums in more detail than was previously addressed. Not a great deal, but it is at least included this time. Okay, Benjamin Hess, we have been revising our old collection museums policy documents with all collection manager and curator approval. Needless to say, we have created many new smaller policies due to the pandemic, continuity of operations, security and access, digital data usage, etc. Do you recommend that these are maintained as is, or in a supplementary section, or integrated in part in the general museum policy? Well, I would recommend at that point, since you have policies that came out of a specific instance, in which case the pandemic, is that you do a review of your entire policy and decide what should become permanent policy and what might possibly be dispensed with at this point. Policies never last forever. Most museums put in a requirement that their policies be reviewed at least once every 5 years, or in the event of a policy failure. So you might want to, it might be time to do a thorough revision. The problem when you start getting ancillary policies, sometimes it gets hard to track what you're really doing, and sometimes you'll wind up inadvertently with policies in conflict. So it sounds like it's time for an overall review, which I would recommend having a committee formed to do, and look over everything and see what should be kept, what shouldn't, what should be integrated, and what's okay. Okay, well, there's a question from Beatriz Leva. Hello, I have a question. How can we evaluate storage costs for the next 20 years in a collection impact statement? That comes from knowing how large the object is, figuring out what your storage cost currently is per unit. So you could do by square foot, by square meter. You know what your utilities are for your building. You know how much how much it basically costs to operate your building, and from that you can extract the part that is your collection storage. And as you continue to add new objects into collection storage, those costs would theoretically accumulate. So you start by basing it on what you know about the current collection, and then the amount of space and the amount of care that that object will require for the next 20 years, and do an extrapolation from that. And of course, it will be an estimate, but by knowing how much it currently costs you to keep your collection, which you should be able to figure out just by taking your current cost and dividing it by the number of objects in your collection, you should be able to make a pretty rational guess as to the next 20 years worth of growth. And you'll need to figure into that, of course, estimates for your increases in your cost of living, and you should be able to get government data to help you make that estimate. All right, I see from Lori a comment coming. I need to respond to Margaret's question about disposal schedules. I did not see that question, so if Margaret or someone could ask that, I'll be happy to give it a shot.
Margaret here.
Okay.
Basically, it's just one of the other things that complicates museums that belong to or part of a governmental entity, say a city or a county, and you get a city or county person swooping in and saying, oh, well, we have disposal schedules, and oh my God, you've got 40-year-old paperwork here you need to shred.
Oh, yes, I have run into that more than once with museums I have worked with. And that is one of those cases of you have to become extremely diplomatic and instruct the county or government officials as to why, in fact, this paper must be saved, why it is important. It is not an easy thing to do, but part of it, a good way to start is invite people in to see your operation. Because if it's somebody in a ministry or government office that's above your museum, they probably don't are not familiar with your day-to-day operations. So you can show them what it is you do. You can also point to recommendations in the literature about how the object information in museum archives needs to be perpetuated. But it's basically, you're going to have to do a fair amount of diplomatic work. There's really no other way around it. And we always talk about things being run like a business, including government, and that often or usually doesn't really work because they are not businesses. Governments are not businesses. Museums are not businesses. And things like depreciation schedules are a good example of that. It interferes with how the institution can function. So you'll have to do your best to diplomatically cajole the person into agreeing with you. Okay, I think that is all the questions. And do we still have a host? Brad, are you still there or are you offline?
I keep losing my connection, so I think we're going to have to end it.
Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. There's some really interesting questions, and thank you for your attention. And thank you, Brad, for giving me the opportunity to talk about this.
If anyone can hear me, I will send out the link to the recording when I get it put together.
All right, bye.